I always feel like you should start writing right when you feel you're not quite ready. You know, I think that's the time to start. Because I think if you keep researching and researching and researching, you're just you're holding off on the real work, you know, because that's not the real work.
How do you keep an underlying sense of danger and tension in every scene?
I think a lot of that is part of the setting, you know, understanding the location lets you kind of describe it in a mysterious, dangerous way. You know, I think if you have a feeling for the location where, you know, is it a seedy area? Is it a high crime area? Is it a rich, wealthy area? You know, like what kind of things are either likely to happen to you there or what might be surprising to happen to you there, depending on the direction you want the scene to go. But I think for me, a lot of that comes down to knowing the location and really getting a feel for it. I know that might sound weird because it's not directly related, but that's usually what I go to first, you know, is like, what is the mood of this area? And then how can I sort of color that mood to be a little bit more dangerous?
So let's say you said that this character, Thomas Caine, is a chameleon in some sense. He can really blend in. So how is he operating when walking through a bad part of town, whereas he's walking through a business center where there's professionals with nice leather shoes?
Most of the stories actually tend to take place in more kind of seedier locations. So I think he's probably more at home in more dangerous areas. I mean, there have been, usually if he's in an area that's more upscale, he just kind of acts like a tourist. You know, he acts like kind of a clueless tourist because he knows that's the most likely scenario for why someone like him might be there. But I don't know, in terms of making the audience feel like something can happen, I feel like you sort of need to have a sense of the locale. You know, there's the book 3 that's set in Sudan, you know, that's a war-torn region. And so I really tried to kind of play up the condition of the buildings, and there's armed soldiers walking around everywhere. And, you know, everyone's kind of on edge, and you see like smoke rising from a building somewhere because it was bombed, you know, the previous day. Like, you know, those kinds of details I think are what make the reader start to think like, oh wow, anything could happen here. Like, you know, who knows? Like, so I think to me it kind of comes down to the location and communicating that to the reader.
It's interesting that you said that he would pretend he was a tourist, and I had heard that from a journalist on a panel. She said that when she would go into certain war-torn countries, she would very much put on like a touristy garb, and because she was less of a threat.
Right.
And so people overlooked her. You know, which is very interesting. Yeah.
I mean, if you're a white guy walking around China, you know, like there are really only a few things that are plausible on why you would be there. So.
I see. So he kind of has a camera and
he doesn't go that far with it, but he just sort of, that just tends to be kind of the rationale, or he just, you know, kind of pretends he might pretend he doesn't understand the language even if he does, or he might ask for, you know, in one scene, he asks someone for directions right before he attacks them, you know, because he's just trying to play off that he's like a lost tourist, you know, things like that.
We imagine there's many, many times you've put Thomas Caine in some impossible position where it seemed like he wasn't going to get out. Is there an example that you can use where you backed yourself into a corner, and how did you get out of it? So you're writing and you're like, wait a minute, how am I getting out of this scene? I don't have a plan for it.
Sure. Actually, in the very first book, the climax takes place on a thing called Tokyo Sky Tree. Actually, when I started writing it, it took place on something called Tokyo Tower, but in the years that it took to finish the book, Tokyo Tower became no longer the tallest structure in Japan. You know, when I started it was, when I finished, it was this thing called Tokyo Sky Tree. So I moved it because I thought it would be more exciting to be the tallest, you know, building in Japan. So Tokyo Sky Tree is this big, big tower. I think it's about half a mile tall with like a little observation deck at the top. And I knew I wanted to have a scene with Caine, you know, fighting people at the top of this tower. And there's like a drone zooming around them and all this stuff going on. You know, for the outline, that's about as much detail as I would do. But when I started writing it, I was like, well, okay, at some point he's going to be hanging off the tower, and then what? You know, like, what do I do? Like, obviously he can't fall, but how do I make it interesting that he doesn't fall? You know, like, what does he do? Does he just pull himself back up? Or like, what makes the bad guy go away? You know, or like, and so I was sort of stuck, you know, I wasn't really sure what to do. But for me, the answer just came down to research. I just kept researching. It was really hard to find accurate blueprints or pictures of the tower. I don't know why, but so I just had to keep at it. Most things when I research, I can usually find what I'm looking for pretty quickly. But for whatever reason, I just had a hard time finding detailed enough pictures where I could sort of plot out the scene in my head. Finally, I found this video of people washing the windows at the top of the tower. And they have these little carts that like lower down and then move along on tracks. And I was like, that's it, And so in the scene, I had him spot one of these carts that's like hanging, half up, and he like is able to swing himself into the cart. And then he has to climb the wire and jump onto, there's this big like glass tube that wraps around the top of the tower where it's like where you can look, 360 from this observation deck. So we had to jump onto this tube and, fight the guy on top of this glass tube, like way above the city. And so the research, just not giving up on the research is really what allowed me to kind of finish that scene in a satisfying way.
If you can't find what you're looking for with the research, at what point do you move on? Do you give yourself a time limit? Or is that part of the fun?
I mean, I certainly wouldn't stay on it for forever. I mean, I do think you have to keep things moving. And so if you're not finding what you need, I think at some point you either change the scene, like you go back, or you just come up with something else. I mean, I think really it all comes down to what's satisfying for you, right? Because that scene I just described, I'm sure you could give that to 10 other writers and they'd come up with 10 other ways to make that interesting. There's all kinds of things you could do, but nothing was clicking for me, So I think at a certain point, if you don't find the answer, then yeah, you either need to just try a different tact or maybe go back. Okay, well, maybe he doesn't fall off. Maybe he throws the guy off and then realizes the guy has something he needs, and he has to get him back. Or, I don't know. You just try to find what would be interesting and work from there. I do think, actually, I think a lot of people over-research. And, I love research and it's important, but I think that a lot of people use research as kind of an excuse to not get started, And I think that that's a danger, actually. I always feel like you should start writing right when you feel you're not quite ready. I think that's the time to start. Because I think if you keep researching and researching and researching, you're just you're holding off on the real work, because that's not the real work. And also I've found that I think you'd be surprised what you can get away with, because if there's something you don't know, you just don't point the metaphoric or the literal camera at it. I mean, and the novella took place in Thailand, and I needed a scene by a river, and I was kind of driving myself crazy trying to find, where would a river be in this region? And, I couldn't find anything. And finally, I just said, why am I going through all this trouble? I just said, I just cut. I just started the new chapter, and he's by a river. I don't say exactly where it is. No one has ever said, well, where could there be a river in this province of Thailand if you only had this many out? I think that people overdo it on that kind of stuff. So, do what you need to kind of get yourself invested and interested. And I think you can do a lot as you go from that point on. The internet's always there.
Do you limit yourself, though? Do you turn the Wi-Fi off?
It's not like a literal time. I just kind of have a sense now from having done it, you're putting it off. Now you're putting it off. It's like you're putting off the work. You're researching too much. You got to just get going. I just kind of have a sense in my head of when it's time to start writing.
But do you turn off your email and different text message?
Not really. Sometimes, every now and then I will, but most of the time I'm able to just ignore it. I'll put my phone in the other room maybe.